My name is Carmen Rodriguez. I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of how my so-called friends turned me into their personal food delivery service for 3 years, only to discover that the woman they treated like their errand girl happened to own half the commercial real estate in their trendy downtown neighborhood. What started as casual favors between neighbors ended with me serving them something they definitely didn't order: a 30-day eviction notice that would teach them the difference between friendship and exploitation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning this all began, I was sitting in my home office in my modest 2-bedroom apartment, managing my property portfolio while drinking coffee from a chipped mug that had seen better days. To anyone looking from the outside, I was just another middle-aged woman living alone, working from home in comfortable clothes that had never seen the inside of a high-end boutique. My neighbors at Riverside Commons had no idea that the quiet woman in apartment 3B, who always said yes to their requests, owned the very building they lived in, along with 7 other properties in the downtown core. I'd built my real estate empire quietly over the past 15 years, starting with a small inheritance from my grandmother and turning it into a multi-million-dollar portfolio through careful investments, strategic purchases, and an understanding of market trends that most people my age were still trying to figure out. But I'd learned early in this business that displaying wealth made you a target for every sob story and get-rich-quick scheme in town, so I maintained the appearance of someone getting by on modest means, while my actual net worth continued to climb steadily year after year. My apartment was intentionally unremarkable. Furniture from discount stores, a television that was large enough to be functional but not impressive, and the kind of practical decorating that suggested someone who shopped at Target rather than designer showrooms. The only hint of my actual financial situation was the sophisticated computer setup in my spare bedroom, where I monitored market reports, managed tenant communications, and coordinated with my property management company. But my neighbors didn't see any of that. What they saw was Carmen, the helpful lady who worked from home and seemed to have flexible hours, making her the perfect person to ask for small favors when they were too busy or too important to handle their own basic needs. It had started innocently enough 3 years ago when Brittany Chen from apartment 4A had knocked on my door with what she called a tiny emergency. Brittany was everything I'd never been and never wanted to be. 28 years old, Instagram perfect, with the kind of aggressively blonde hair that required monthly maintenance appointments, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's rent. She worked in social media marketing for some startup that seemed to involve taking pictures of herself using various products, and she treated every interaction like she was performing for an invisible audience. "Carmen, I'm literally dying," she'd said that first day, clutching her phone like it was a life support device. "I have this super important client call in 20 minutes, and I promised I'd post content about this new sushi place, but my car is making this weird noise and I can't drive it until my mechanic can look at it tomorrow. Could you possibly, grab me some food from Sakura House? I'll totally pay you back for gas and everything." The request had seemed reasonable. Sakura House was only 15 minutes away, and I genuinely didn't mind helping a neighbor in what appeared to be a legitimate bind. I'd driven over, placed her order, paid with my own card since she'd forgotten to give me cash, and delivered her artfully arranged sushi platter with a smile. Brittany had been effusively grateful, promising to Venmo me immediately, and gushing about how I was literally a lifesaver and the best neighbor ever. The Venmo payment never came, but when she knocked on my door 2 weeks later with another urgent request, I didn't mention it. This time, she needed Vietnamese food from a place across town, because she was working on a campaign for a wellness brand and needed to create content showing her dedication to clean eating. Again, I'd driven across the city, paid for her order, and delivered it to her door while she set up ring lights and camera equipment to document her healthy lifestyle choices. By the third request, a pattern was emerging, but I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt. Brittany was young, clearly overwhelmed by her career demands, and probably just disorganized about money. The fourth time she needed food delivered, I mentioned the previous payments she'd forgotten, and she'd looked genuinely mortified, promising to send everything through Venmo immediately and adding an extra $20 for my trouble. That payment never materialized either, But by then, word had spread to other residents about my apparent willingness to run food errands. Jake Morrison from 2C had started texting me whenever he was too busy with his cryptocurrency trading to leave his apartment. Melissa and David Kim from the penthouse had begun treating me like their personal concierge, sending detailed orders for expensive meals from restaurants they were too busy to visit themselves. What had started as occasional favors for one scattered neighbor had evolved into a regular service for half the building. I was making food runs 3 or 4 times a week, always paying up front, with promises of reimbursement that rarely materialized, always accommodating special requests and dietary restrictions, always being thanked profusely while somehow never being paid consistently. The requests grew more elaborate and demanding as my neighbors became comfortable with the arrangement. Brittany started asking for specific items that required visits to multiple restaurants, then complained if the presentation wasn't perfect when she unpacked everything for her photos. Jake began treating me like his personal DoorDash driver, sending texts at all hours with urgent demands for food that had to be delivered within specific time windows to accommodate his trading schedule. The Kims were the worst, treating me like hired help while maintaining the fiction that we were doing each other neighborly favors. They'd send me detailed orders with modifications and substitutions, then critique the quality of the food as if I'd prepared it myself. Melissa had actually asked me to return items to restaurants when they weren't prepared exactly to her specifications, apparently not understanding that most places don't accept returns on consumed food orders. But the breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, when I was dealing with a crisis at one of my commercial properties. A burst pipe had flooded the ground floor of a building I owned in the Arts District, and I was coordinating with emergency repair crews, insurance adjusters, and displaced tenants, while trying to minimize the damage to both the property and my relationship with the businesses that rented space there. I was on a conference call with my insurance agent and a restoration company when my phone started buzzing with text messages. Brittany needed Thai food from a place 30 minutes away because she was creating content for a client campaign that had to be posted by midnight. Jake wanted Chinese food from his favorite restaurant, but only if they could guarantee delivery within 45 minutes because he had an important crypto call with investors in Hong Kong. The Kims needed a full dinner for 6 people because they were hosting Melissa's colleagues for an impromptu business dinner, and they'd specifically requested that I coordinate orders from 3 different restaurants to accommodate various dietary restrictions. All of this while I was dealing with thousands of dollars in property damage and trying to manage a legitimate business crisis that required.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
My immediate attention. I'd ignored the texts initially, assuming that for once, they'd understand that I might not be available to drop everything for their dinner plans. But the messages kept coming, each one more demanding and entitled than the last. Brittany had actually called me twice, leaving voicemails about how she was depending on me and couldn't understand why I wasn't responding immediately. Jake had sent increasingly aggressive texts questioning my reliability and suggesting that if I couldn't commit to helping when people needed me, maybe I shouldn't offer to help at all. The Kims had escalated to knocking on my door, with David actually lecturing me about the importance of following through on commitments when I'd explained that I was dealing with a work emergency. "Carmen, I understand you have your own things going on," David had said, standing in my doorway with the condescending tone of someone addressing an employee who disappointed them. "But when you tell people they can count on you, they make plans based on that assumption. Melissa's boss is coming to dinner tonight, and this could be really important for her career. We've been ordering from you for months now, and we've never had reliability issues before." The casual entitlement of that statement, ordering from you, had hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't their neighbor doing occasional favors anymore. I was their unpaid delivery service, expected to be available on demand regardless of my own circumstances or priorities. They'd transformed a series of small kindnesses into an assumed obligation, and they were genuinely angry that I wasn't fulfilling my expected role in their comfortable routines. That night, after finally resolving the property crisis and declining all the food requests, I'd sat in my home office and really looked at the pattern of behavior I'd been enabling for 3 years. I pulled up my credit card statements and calculated exactly how much money I'd spent on other people's meals, how many hours I'd devoted to driving around the city fulfilling their requests, how many times I'd rearranged my own schedule to accommodate their demands. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, I'd spent nearly $8,000 on food for my neighbors, money that had been reimbursed less than 30% of the time. I'd made over 200 individual food runs, spending roughly 6 hours per week on average, serving as their personal delivery service. I'd canceled my own plans, postponed business calls, and delayed property inspections to ensure that my neighbors got their meals when they wanted them. But more than the money or the time, what bothered me was the complete lack of reciprocity or genuine gratitude. None of these people had ever offered to help me with anything. When my car had been in the shop for a week, none of them had offered rides or assistance with errands. When I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed with work during casual conversations, none of them had offered to help, or even asked follow-up questions about what kind of work kept me so busy. They'd created a relationship where I provided services and absorbed costs, while they received benefits, and offered nothing in return except the kind of performative appreciation that made them feel good about accepting so much help. I was useful to them in the same way that a vending machine is useful, reliable, convenient, and not requiring any emotional investment or genuine concern for my well-being. That realization had been the beginning of my decision to change the dynamic entirely. My neighbors thought they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. They saw a middle-aged woman living modestly, working from home in flexible circumstances that made her available for their convenience. They had no idea that their reliable food delivery service was actually their landlord, with the power to make their comfortable lives significantly less comfortable if she chose to exercise it. But before I implemented any major changes, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Over the next week, I began paying closer attention to my neighbors, actual circumstances rather than the personas they projected. I started researching their backgrounds, their income sources, their spending patterns, and their lease agreements, with a thoroughness that would have impressed the private investigators I occasionally hired for tenant screenings. What I discovered was fascinating and deeply concerning. Brittany's social media career was almost entirely fictional. She had impressive follower numbers, but most of her accounts were inflated with purchased followers and engagement bots. The brand partnerships she constantly mentioned were mostly unpaid collaborations, where she received free products in exchange for posts, not the lucrative sponsorship deals she implied. Her actual income was probably less than $20,000 per year, barely enough to cover her rent, let alone the designer lifestyle she displayed online. Jake's cryptocurrency trading was equally fraudulent. He spent his days moving small amounts of money between different platforms, creating the appearance of active trading while actually gambling with funds he couldn't afford to lose. His apartment was filled with expensive equipment and multiple monitor setups that suggested serious professional activity, but his actual trading history showed consistent losses and increasingly desperate attempts to recover his initial investments. The Kims were the most interesting case. David worked in middle management for a tech company, and Melissa had a mid-level position at a marketing firm. Their combined income was solid, but not exceptional, certainly not enough to support the luxury lifestyle they maintained in their penthouse apartment. But they'd figured out how to live far above their means by treating their neighbors like unpaid service providers and manipulating social situations to get others to absorb costs they should have been paying themselves. All three households were living beyond their actual means, maintaining expensive lifestyles through a combination of credit, deception, and exploitation of people they perceived as having less status or power. They'd identified me as someone they could take advantage of, and they'd systematically expanded that advantage over 3 years until I'd become an essential component of their financial strategies. But what none of them realized was that their elaborate deceptions and careful budget management were built on a foundation they didn't control. Every lease they'd signed, every monthly rent payment they'd made, every assumption they'd formed about their housing security was connected to decisions I made as the owner of their building. They'd been using me as their personal delivery service while I literally held the power to end their tenancy whenever I chose to exercise it. The irony was too perfect to ignore. The woman they'd been treating like a convenient servant was actually the person who controlled the most important aspect of their daily lives. They'd exploited someone they assumed was powerless, never realizing that she held more power over their circumstances than anyone else in their social circles. Over the following days, I began developing a plan that would teach my neighbors about the real consequences of taking advantage of people they didn't understand. It wouldn't be cruel or vindictive, but it would be thorough and educational. They'd been treating me like I existed for their convenience, and they were about to learn exactly how inconvenient life could become when the person they'd been exploiting decided to stop accommodating their assumptions. The first phase of my plan was simple. I would stop providing food delivery services immediately, without explanation or negotiation. No more responding to texts requesting restaurant runs. No more accommodating special dietary needs. No more fronting money for meals that would never be reimbursed. I would return to being a neighbor rather than an unpaid employee, and I would observe how they responded to the loss of services they'd begun taking for granted. The second phase would involve more careful evaluation of their lease agreements and rent payment histories. All three households had been model tenants from a technical standpoint, never missing payments or violating major lease terms. But there were always opportunities for landlords to make life more challenging for tenants who didn't appreciate what they had, especially when those tenants had been demonstrating poor judgment and entitled behavior in other areas of their lives. The third phase would depend on how they handled the first two phases. If they could acknowledge their mistakes, apologize for their exploitation, and demonstrate genuine respect for boundaries and reciprocity, then perhaps we could establish a healthier dynamic going forward. But if they doubled down on their entitlement and tried to pressure me into resuming my unpaid services, then I would be forced to help them understand exactly who they'd been taking advantage of for the past 3 years. The first test came the very next evening, when Brittany sent her usual Friday night text requesting dinner from an upscale Mexican restaurant across town. She needed specific items for a weekend photo shoot, she explained, and she was counting on me to handle the logistics because she had to prepare her apartment for the perfect lighting setup. I read the message, set my phone aside, and continued working on a property management report as if nothing had happened. 20 minutes later, she sent a follow-up text asking if I'd received her message and when she could expect delivery. An hour after that, she called my phone directly, leaving a voicemail expressing confusion about my lack of response and concern that something might be wrong. The calls and texts continued throughout the evening, escalating from confusion to frustration to outright anger, as Brittany realized that her reliable food delivery service was no longer responding to orders. By 9 o'clock, she was knocking on my door, her voice carrying through the hallway as she demanded an explanation for what she called my sudden irresponsible behavior. I didn't answer the door, and eventually she gave up and presumably ordered delivery through actual paid services like a normal adult. But the incident had revealed exactly how dependent she'd become on my unpaid assistance, and how little consideration she'd given to the possibility that I might not always be available for her convenience. Jake's reaction was more aggressive and immediate. When I didn't respond to his Saturday afternoon text requesting Chinese food, he'd shown up at my door within an hour, demanding to know why I was suddenly being unreliable and inconsiderate. He actually used the phrase, breach of contract, as if our neighborly arrangement had been a formal business agreement that I was violating by changing the terms. "Carmen, I don't understand what's going on here," he said when I finally opened my door, his voice carrying the irritated tone of someone addressing incompetent customer service. "I've been counting on you for food delivery for months now, and suddenly you're just not responding? I have important calls this weekend, and I can't waste time driving around town when you've always handled this stuff before." The conversation that followed was illuminating in its revelation of how Jake perceived our relationship. In his mind, I was a service provider who had established a pattern of availability and reliability, and my sudden change in behavior was a personal failing that inconvenienced him unfairly. He genuinely couldn't understand why I might not want to spend my weekend driving around town to accommodate his schedule, and he seemed genuinely frustrated that I would change our arrangement without consulting him first. The Kim's response was the most entitled and revealing. When I didn't respond to their Sunday evening request for dinner party catering, David had called me directly and left a voicemail explaining that they had guests coming over, and had specifically told people that dinner would be provided. My failure to respond was creating a social embarrassment that could damage Melissa's professional relationships, and he needed me to call back immediately to discuss how we could resolve the situation. When I still didn't respond, Melissa had shown up at my door with a bottle of wine and an expression of concerned sympathy, as if I might be going through some kind of personal crisis that was affecting my judgment. She'd actually suggested that if I was having financial difficulties, they might be able to help me budget more effectively, apparently assuming that money problems were the only possible explanation for my sudden unavailability. "Carmen, we've all been worried about you," she said, settling into my living room as if she'd been invited to stay for a lengthy conversation. "When you stopped responding to messages, we thought maybe something serious was happening in your life. David and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we value everything you do for this building. You really hold this community together with all the little things you do for everyone." The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. She'd managed to transform 3 years of exploitation into a narrative where I was a valued community member, whose contributions were appreciated, while simultaneously positioning herself and David as generous neighbors who were concerned about my well-being. But underlying the fake sympathy was a clear expectation that I would resume my food delivery services once I'd received sufficient recognition for my efforts. After a week of ignored requests and increasingly frustrated neighbors, I moved to the second phase of my plan. I began conducting detailed reviews of all the lease agreements for the building, looking for opportunities to implement changes that would make my tenants' lives less comfortable while remaining within the legal boundaries of landlord-tenant relationships. What I discovered was a goldmine of possibilities. All of the leases had been written with standard terms that gave me significant flexibility as the property owner, including the right to implement new policies with 30 days' notice, the authority to schedule necessary maintenance and inspections with minimal advance warning, and the power to modify common area usage rules to reflect changing building needs. More importantly, I noticed that several of my tenants had been violating lease terms in small but significant ways. Brittany had been using her apartment for commercial photography shoots without obtaining proper permits or notifying building management. Jake had installed cryptocurrency mining equipment that was creating unusual electrical loads and potential fire hazards. The Kims had been subletting their guest room through short-term rental platforms without authorization, essentially running an illegal hotel operation from their penthouse. None of these violations were serious enough to justify immediate eviction, but they provided excellent leverage for implementing new policies and restrictions that would make their comfortable routines significantly more challenging. And as the building owner, I had every right to enforce lease terms that had been ignored due to my previously lax management approach. I started with building-wide policy changes that would affect all tenants but would be particularly inconvenient for my former food delivery clients. New noise restrictions during peak photography hours would make it impossible for Brittany to conduct her shoots during optimal lighting conditions. Enhanced electrical safety inspections would require Jake to disconnect his mining equipment until he could prove it met current building codes. Stricter policies about guest access and short-term rentals would shut down the Kims' supplementary income stream immediately. Each policy change was accompanied by formal notices delivered through my property management company, maintaining professional distance while implementing increasingly restrictive rules. I was no longer Carmen, the helpful neighbor who bent over backwards to accommodate everyone's needs. I was Carmen Rodriguez, property owner, exercising her legal rights to manage her investment according to current market standards and safety requirements. The responses were immediate and predictable. Brittany called the property management office to complain about the new photography restrictions, apparently not realizing that her complaints were being forwarded directly to me as the building owner. She demanded to speak with someone in authority who could override what she called unreasonable limitations on normal apartment usage. Jake became increasingly aggressive about the electrical inspection requirements, threatening to involve lawyers and claiming that the new policies were targeting him specifically because of his successful cryptocurrency investments. He seemed to genuinely believe that his trading activities made him important enough to demand special accommodations, and he was outraged that building policies were interfering with his business operations. The Kims tried to negotiate around the guest restrictions by offering to pay additional fees for continued short-term rental privileges. When that approach failed, they attempted to organize other tenants into collective resistance against what they called increasingly restrictive management policies. They seemed to assume that I would back down from enforcing legitimate lease terms if enough residents complained about the changes. But none of them had figured out that their complaints were going directly to the person they'd been treating like their unpaid servant for 3 years. They were demanding that building management override policies implemented by the same woman they'd been exploiting, never making the connection between their landlord's stricter approach and their neighbors' sudden unavailability for food delivery services. The third phase of my plan began when it became clear that none of them were capable of connecting their past behavior with their current difficulties. Instead of reflecting on whether they might have damaged their relationship with a helpful neighbor, they'd chosen to blame building management for their problems, while continuing to pressure me personally to resume providing unpaid services. The breaking point came when David Kim knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening, carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone prepared for serious negotiation. He'd done research on tenant rights, consulted with other residents, and apparently decided that a direct confrontation was the best approach to resolving what he saw as my unreasonable behavior. "Carmen, we need to talk about this situation," he said, settling into my living room without invitation and spreading papers across my coffee table. "I've been looking into your rights as a tenant and our rights as residents of this building, and I think there are some things you need to understand about the legal implications of suddenly changing long-established patterns of behavior." The condescension in his voice was extraordinary. He was actually threatening me with legal action for refusing to continue providing unpaid food delivery services, apparently believing that 3 years of accommodating his requests had created some kind of contractual obligation that I couldn't terminate without his consent. "David," I said calmly, sitting down across from him and reviewing the documents he'd prepared, "before we discuss legal implications, there's something I need to tell you about my situation that might change your perspective on this conversation." I walked to my home office and returned with a folder containing lease agreements, property deeds, and business incorporation papers. I spread them across the coffee table next to his tenant rights research, watching his face as he began to process what he was seeing. "I am Carmen Rodriguez, owner of Riverside Commons and 7 other commercial properties in the downtown district," I said quietly, letting the words sink in while he stared at documents that proved I wasn't just another tenant he could intimidate. "You've been paying rent to my property management company for the past 4 years, and every month, that money has been deposited into accounts that I control as the sole owner of this building." The silence that followed was absolute. David's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he realized that the woman he'd been treating like hired help was actually his landlord. The person he'd just threatened with legal action over food delivery services was the same person who controlled whether he continued living in his expensive penthouse apartment. "That's impossible," he said weakly, shuffling through the documents as if he could find some evidence that they were fabricated. "You live in a regular apartment. You dress like... you work from home doing whatever." "I work from home managing real estate investments and property operations," I corrected gently. "The same investments that have funded your comfortable lifestyle for the past 3 years, including the building you live in and the neighborhood amenities you enjoy. I've been subsidizing your life in more ways than you realize." Over the next hour, I explained the full scope of the situation to David while he sat in stunned silence, processing the complete reversal of power dynamics he thought he understood. The helpful neighbor he'd been exploiting wasn't just another resident. She was the person who controlled the most fundamental aspect of his daily life. The woman he'd been pressuring to provide free services was actually someone he needed to keep happy for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship or community harmony. But more than that, I explained how his behavior and the behavior of his neighbors had demonstrated exactly the kind of poor judgment and disrespect for others that I considered when evaluating tenants for lease renewals. People who took advantage of perceived kindness, who refused to honor financial obligations, and who treated service providers with entitlement and contempt were not the kind of residents I wanted in my properties long term. "David," I said as our conversation was winding down, "tomorrow morning you and your neighbors are going to receive formal notices from my property management company. Jake will be required to bring his electrical usage into compliance with building codes within 30 days or face lease termination. Brittany will need to cease all commercial photography activities in her apartment immediately and pay back fees for unauthorized business usage. And you and Melissa will need to discontinue your short-term rental operation and pay penalties for violation of lease terms." His face had gone completely pale as I outlined the consequences of behavior they'd probably forgotten I'd witnessed. But more importantly, all 3 households will be receiving 60-day notices of non-renewal for your lease agreements. I've decided that I prefer tenants who understand the difference between community cooperation and exploitation of convenient neighbors. The eviction notices weren't punitive revenge. They were legitimate business decisions based on demonstrated patterns of poor judgment and disrespect for others. Tenants who took advantage of perceived power imbalances, who failed to honor financial commitments, and who treated service providers like disposable conveniences were risks I no longer wanted to assume as a property owner. Over the following weeks, I watched my former neighbors scramble to find new housing in a competitive rental market, while also dealing with the financial and legal consequences of lease violations they'd thought were invisible. Brittany's photography business collapsed when she lost access to her carefully arranged studio space. Jake's cryptocurrency trading became impossible when he could no longer afford the electrical costs of his mining operation. The Kims discovered that luxury rentals were much more expensive when you couldn't supplement your income through illegal subletting. But the most satisfying moment came when Brittany knocked on my door one final time before moving out, carrying a small gift bag and wearing the kind of contrite expression that suggested she'd finally figured out who she'd been taking advantage of for 3 years. "Carmen, I brought you something," she said, holding out a gift card to one of the restaurants she'd frequently requested deliveries from. "I know I never paid you back for all the food runs, and I wanted to try to make that right before I left. I also wanted to apologize for the way I treated you. I didn't realize. I never thought about how much you were doing for all of us, or how unfair it was to expect so much without giving anything back." The apology was genuine, but it was 3 years too late and motivated by consequences rather than genuine recognition of wrongdoing. "Brittany?" I said gently, accepting the gift card but not the implied forgiveness it represented. "The problem wasn't just the money or the time. The problem was that you never saw me as a person whose feelings and circumstances mattered. You saw me as a service you could access whenever you needed something, and you never considered what that service cost me personally or financially." After they'd all moved out, I renovated their apartments and raised the rents to market rates, attracting new tenants who understood appropriate boundaries and reciprocal relationships. The building became a more pleasant place to live, with residents who treated each other with genuine respect rather than looking for opportunities to exploit perceived advantages. But the real victory wasn't financial or even personal. It was educational. 3 households had learned expensive lessons about the consequences of taking advantage of people they didn't understand. They'd discovered that kindness isn't weakness, that accommodation isn't obligation, and that the person you're exploiting might have more power than you realize. My neighbors had made me their unpaid DoorDash driver because they assumed I was powerless to refuse their demands. But when I finally delivered them something they hadn't ordered, the reality of their own behavior and its consequences, they discovered that the woman they'd been taking for granted was actually the person who controlled their ability to live in the neighborhood they loved. Sometimes the best way to teach people about respect is to show them what happens when they lose access to the things they've been taking for granted. My former neighbors learned that lesson the hard way, through eviction notices delivered by the same woman they'd treated like their personal delivery service. And sometimes, the person you're exploiting is the same person who holds the power to end your comfortable life whenever they decide they've had enough of your behavior. My neighbors found that out the hard way too, when their unpaid DoorDash driver turned out to be their landlord. The next time they need food delivered, they'll have to pay for it like everyone else. And the next time they want to live somewhere nice, they'll need to figure out how to do it without exploiting the people around them. Those are lessons that will serve them well in whatever neighborhoods they end up in next. As for me, I went back to managing my properties and investments, secure in the knowledge that my buildings are now filled with tenants who understand the difference between community cooperation and personal exploitation. And whenever I order takeout for myself, I always tip the delivery driver generously, because I know exactly how much work goes into bringing people the food they want when they want it. The woman they'd called their reliable neighbor had delivered them their most important lesson yet. Respect isn't optional, boundaries matter, and the person you're taking advantage of might be the same person who controls your future. They just had to learn it through eviction notices instead of fortune cookies. The morning after David Kim's revelation about my true identity, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word had spread through the building faster than a grease fire, and my former food delivery clients were in full panic mode. The comfortable fiction they'd been living in had shattered overnight, and each of them was scrambling to manage the fallout in their own distinctly predictable way. Brittany had sent a series of increasingly frantic messages, starting at 3 in the morning, cycling through denial, bargaining, anger, and what appeared to be the beginning of acceptance. Her first texts questioned whether David had been telling the truth about my ownership of the building, followed by attempts to explain away 3 years of unpaid food bills as simple oversights, then accusations that I'd been deliberately deceiving everyone by not revealing my financial status, and finally desperate pleas for a chance to make things right before any permanent decisions were made about her lease. Jake's messages were more aggressive and threatening, demanding an immediate meeting to discuss what he called fraudulent misrepresentation and bait-and-switch tactics. He'd apparently convinced himself that I'd somehow tricked him into believing I was just another tenant, and that my failure to disclose my landlord status constituted some kind of legal violation that would protect him from lease termination. His final message, sent at 6 in the morning, informed me that he'd retained an attorney and would be pursuing all available legal remedies for what he termed landlord harassment and discriminatory eviction practices. The Kims had taken a different approach entirely, sending a formal email through their personal attorney requesting a meeting to discuss lease modifications that would allow them to remain in the building while addressing any concerns I might have about their tenancy. Their message was professionally written and carefully worded to avoid admitting any wrongdoing while opening negotiations for a settlement that would be mutually beneficial to all parties involved. But it was the message from my property management company that really caught my attention. Maria Santos, who'd been managing my buildings for the past 8 years, had received multiple calls from tenants, claiming that I was engaged in retaliatory eviction practices and requesting emergency interventions to protect their rights. She needed to schedule a meeting immediately to discuss the situation and ensure that any actions I was planning to take would comply with local tenant protection laws. I made coffee in my quiet kitchen and considered the chaos I'd unleashed simply by revealing my true identity to one person who couldn't keep his mouth shut. None of my neighbors had ever asked what I did for work or wondered how I could afford to make constant food runs while apparently living on modest means. They'd been so focused on what I could do for them that they'd never bothered to learn anything real about who I actually was or what my circumstances might be. Now that they knew I controlled their housing situation, they were suddenly very interested in understanding my perspective and accommodating my needs. The same people who'd ignored my calls when they owed me money were now desperately trying to reach me to negotiate terms for continued occupancy. The neighbors who'd treated me like a convenience service were suddenly eager to establish respectful relationships based on mutual consideration and proper boundaries. But their panic revealed something important about how they'd perceived our relationships all along. They weren't sorry for taking advantage of me. They were sorry they'd taken advantage of someone who turned out to have power over them. If I'd been revealed as a struggling single woman barely making ends meet, they would have felt justified in their exploitation and probably would have continued making demands for unpaid services. The only thing that had changed their attitude was learning that I could retaliate in ways that would genuinely hurt them. I called Maria and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon, knowing that any actions I took from this point forward would need to be carefully documented and legally defensible. My former neighbors were clearly preparing to fight their evictions, using every available resource, and I needed to ensure that my property management decisions were based on legitimate business concerns rather than personal revenge. Maria arrived at my apartment promptly at 2 o'clock, carrying a thick folder of tenant files and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning managing a crisis she didn't fully understand. She was a consummate professional who'd helped me navigate complex landlord-tenant situations before, but she'd never dealt with a case where the property owner had been personally involved with tenants who didn't know she owned their building. "Carmen, I need to understand exactly what happened here," she said, settling into my living room and spreading tenant files across my coffee table. "I've got 3 different households claiming you've been harassing them and threatening illegal eviction. But I've also got documented lease violations that would justify termination for cause. What's the real story?" I explained the situation from the beginning, starting with the innocent favor requests that had evolved into systematic exploitation, continuing through my decision to research my neighbors, backgrounds and financial situations, and ending with my choice to reveal my identity and implement legitimate consequences for their behavior. Maria took careful notes throughout my explanation, asking clarifying questions about dates, amounts, and specific incidents that had influenced my decision-making process. "From a legal standpoint, you're on solid ground," she said, after reviewing all the documentation I'd gathered. The lease violations are well documented and serious enough to justify termination for cause. The electrical safety issues in Jake's apartment could actually result in criminal charges if he refuses to comply with building codes. Brittany's commercial photography business violates zoning regulations as well as her lease terms. And the Kim's short-term rental operation is completely illegal in this building. She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. But from a practical standpoint, you need to be prepared for a fight. All three households have resources and connections that will allow them to challenge your decisions through legal channels, regulatory complaints, and probably social media campaigns designed to damage your reputation as a property owner. They're going to claim that your personal relationship with them creates a conflict of interest that invalidates your business decisions. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from Jake's attorney demanding immediate withdrawal of his lease termination notice and threatening a lawsuit for what they called retaliatory eviction, based on personal disagreements rather than legitimate landlord concerns. The letter accused me of using my position as property owner to punish tenants who had declined to provide personal services, and it demanded financial compensation for moving expenses and emotional distress caused by my alleged harassment. The legal language was impressive, but the underlying argument was absurd. Jake's attorney was essentially claiming that my refusal to continue providing unpaid food delivery services had created a hostile environment that justified his aggressive behavior, and that my subsequent enforcement of lease terms was retaliation for his reasonable expectations of continued neighborly assistance. Brittany took a different approach, showing up at my door that evening with red eyes and a carefully prepared speech about how much our friendship had meant to her over the years. She'd brought a bottle of expensive wine and a handwritten letter explaining how overwhelmed she'd been by her career pressures, and how grateful she was for all the help I'd provided during difficult times in her life. "Carmen, I know I made mistakes," she said, settling into my living room as if we were about to have a heart-to-heart conversation between old friends. "I got so focused on building my brand and managing my content schedule that I stopped thinking about how my requests were affecting you personally. I never meant to take advantage of our friendship, and I certainly never meant to treat you like you were working for me instead of helping me as a neighbor." The performance was impressive in its calculation. Brittany had clearly spent considerable time crafting a narrative that acknowledged some responsibility, while minimizing the extent of her exploitation and emphasizing the mutual benefits of our relationship. She was positioning herself as someone who had made understandable mistakes due to external pressures, rather than someone who had systematically taken advantage of perceived generosity for 3 years. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realized that I need to make things right," she continued, pulling out her phone and opening her Venmo app. "I calculated everything I owe you for food deliveries, and I added interest and a service fee to account for your time and gas money. I know it doesn't fix the way I treated you, but I want to show you that I understand the value of what you did for me." The Venmo payment notification appeared on my phone as she spoke, $2,200, which was probably close to accurate for her portion of the money I'd spent on unpaid food deliveries over 3 years. It was a substantial amount for someone with her limited income, and transferring it immediately demonstrated both her desperation to avoid eviction and her belated recognition that my services had actual monetary value. But the payment also revealed how carefully she'd been tracking our interactions, despite pretending to forget about reimbursements. She knew exactly how much she owed, because she'd been consciously choosing not to pay it, not because she'd been genuinely confused or overwhelmed by her financial obligations. The money had always been available. She'd simply decided that my services weren't worth paying for as long as she could get them for free. "Brittany," I said gently, accepting the payment but not the implied forgiveness it represented, "I appreciate that you're taking financial responsibility for the services you received. But the money was never the main issue. The problem was that you treated me like a service you were entitled to use rather than a person who was choosing to help you. You never considered my schedule, my convenience, or my financial situation when you made your requests." Over the next hour, she tried various approaches to convince me to reconsider her lease termination. She offered to pay increased rent to compensate for the inconvenience she'd caused. She promised to recommend me to other potential tenants who would be more respectful and reliable. She even suggested that she could provide social media marketing services for my property management business, leveraging her online following to promote my buildings to potential renters. Each offer revealed more about how she'd perceived our relationship, and how she was trying to reframe it now that she understood the power dynamics involved. She was still thinking in terms of transactions and exchanges, rather than genuine respect and consideration. She wanted to negotiate her way out of consequences, rather than demonstrate actual understanding of why her behavior had been problematic. The Kims requested a formal meeting through their attorney, and we met the following evening in the conference room at my property management office. They arrived with legal representation, financial documents, and a detailed proposal for lease modifications that would address my concerns while allowing them to remain in their penthouse apartment. Ms. Rodriguez, their attorney began, my clients want to acknowledge that there may have been some misunderstandings about the nature of their relationship with you over the past few years. They're prepared to make significant concessions to resolve any concerns you might have about their tenancy, including immediate payment of all outstanding fees and penalties, cessation of any activities that might violate lease terms, and implementation of new communication protocols to ensure that future interactions remain appropriate and professional. David and Melissa sat silently while their lawyer outlined their proposal, occasionally nodding agreement but avoiding direct eye contact with me. They were letting legal professionals handle negotiations while they tried to maintain plausible deniability about the extent of their exploitation and manipulation over the past 3 years. Their settlement offer was comprehensive and expensive. They would pay a $15,000 penalty for unauthorized short-term rental activities, plus back fees for unreported income generated through their illegal hotel operation. They would accept a 20% rent increase to reflect current market rates for penthouse apartments in comparable buildings. They would sign modified lease agreements with stricter terms regarding guest policies, noise restrictions, and commercial activities. Most importantly, they would agree to have no personal contact with me outside of formal communications through the property management company. They recognized that their previous relationship with me had created complications that were inappropriate for a landlord-tenant dynamic, and they were willing to establish clear boundaries that would prevent future misunderstandings. The offer was financially attractive and legally sound, but it was also completely missing the point of why I'd decided to terminate their lease in the first place. They were trying to solve a problem they thought was about money and lease violations, when the actual problem was about character and judgment. People who would systematically exploit a neighbor for 3 years while maintaining friendly social interactions were not the kind of tenants I wanted in my properties, regardless of how much they were willing to pay to stay. I appreciate the thoroughness of your proposal, I said after reviewing all the documentation they'd prepared. But my decision to terminate your lease isn't based primarily on financial considerations or technical lease violations. It's based on my assessment that you've demonstrated poor judgment and a lack of respect for others that makes you unsuitable tenants for my properties. The silence that followed was heavy with implications that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. David and Melissa had built their entire defense around the assumption that I was motivated by money or personal revenge, and they'd crafted their settlement offer accordingly. But they couldn't negotiate their way out of a character assessment, and they couldn't pay enough to change my evaluation of their trustworthiness and reliability as tenants. Over the following weeks, all 3 households tried different strategies to avoid the consequences of their lease terminations. Jake's attorney filed complaints with the City Housing Authority claiming that I was engaging in discriminatory eviction practices. Brittany started a social media campaign portraying herself as a victim of landlord harassment and wealthy privilege. The Kims attempted to organize other tenants into collective action against what they called increasingly restrictive building management policies. But their efforts were undermined by their own documented behavior and the legitimate business reasons for my decisions. The Housing Authority investigation concluded that the lease terminations were justified by serious violations that posed safety and legal risks to the property. Brittany's social media campaign backfired when followers began asking pointed questions about why she'd been receiving free services from someone she was now attacking publicly. The other tenants in the building declined to support the Kims, organizing efforts after learning about the illegal short-term rental operation that had been creating security and noise issues for months. The most revealing incident occurred when Jake attempted to continue living in his apartment past his lease termination date, apparently believing that legal challenges to his eviction would allow him to remain in the building indefinitely. When my property management company sent maintenance personnel to change the locks and secure the unit, They discovered that Jake had been running an extensive cryptocurrency mining operation that violated multiple building codes and fire safety regulations. The electrical modifications he'd made to support his equipment were not only unauthorized but genuinely dangerous, creating fire hazards that could have endangered every resident in the building. The heat generated by his mining equipment had been damaging walls and creating moisture problems that were beginning to affect neighboring units. Most seriously, the electrical load he'd been drawing was far beyond what the building's systems were designed to handle, creating risks of power outages and electrical fires. The fire department inspection that followed Jake's eviction revealed that his equipment setup violated at least 6 different safety codes and would have required thousands of dollars in building modifications to bring into compliance. The inspector actually commended me for removing such a serious hazard from the building before it could cause injuries or property damage to other residents. Jake's attorney quietly dropped their lawsuit after learning about the fire safety violations, apparently realizing that drawing attention to their client's illegal activities would create more problems than it would solve. Jake himself disappeared from social media and local networking events, presumably dealing with legal and financial consequences that extended well beyond his housing situation. Brittany's departure was more theatrical and self-pitying. She documented her entire moving process on social media, creating content about the challenges of finding affordable housing and the difficulties of dealing with unreasonable landlords who didn't understand the needs of small business owners. Her posts generated sympathy from followers who didn't understand the full context of her situation, but they also attracted attention from other landlords who recognized her as a potential problem tenant. The narrative she created portrayed me as a wealthy property owner who had befriended her under false pretenses, then used my power to punish her when she couldn't meet unrealistic expectations for personal services. She never acknowledged the 3 years of unpaid food deliveries or the systematic way she'd exploited my willingness to help. Instead, she positioned herself as a victim of class-based discrimination and landlord abuse. But her social media strategy backfired when several of her followers began asking detailed questions about the services she'd mentioned receiving. When they learned that she'd been getting free food delivery for 3 years from someone she was now attacking as an exploitative landlord, the sympathy she'd been generating quickly turned to criticism about her own behavior and judgment. The Kims handled their departure with more dignity, quietly moving out before their lease termination date and avoiding any public drama about their situation. They paid their outstanding penalties without complaint and left their apartment in excellent condition, apparently recognizing that maintaining their professional reputations was more important than winning a public relations battle they were likely to lose. But even their relatively graceful exit revealed interesting details about their true circumstances. The moving company they hired was one of the most expensive in the city, and they transported an impressive collection of high-end furniture and artwork that seemed inconsistent with their claimed financial struggles. Their new apartment, which I learned about through casual social media monitoring, was actually more expensive than their previous rent, suggesting that money had never been the real issue in their relationship with me. The most satisfying part of the entire process was discovering how quickly my building's atmosphere improved once the 3 problem households had been removed. The new tenants I selected were professionals who understood appropriate boundaries and reciprocal relationships. They were friendly without being presumptuous, helpful without expecting constant assistance in return, and respectful of both the building's rules and their neighbors' privacy. The building's community dynamic shifted from one where certain residents felt entitled to exploit others to one where everyone contributed appropriately to maintaining a pleasant living environment. New tenants offered genuine reciprocal assistance, helping with package deliveries when neighbors were traveling, sharing information about building maintenance issues, organizing voluntary social activities that didn't create obligations for reluctant participants. Most importantly, I was able to return to being a normal building owner rather than an unpaid service provider for demanding residents. My relationship with tenants became professional and appropriate, based on clear expectations and mutual respect rather than exploitation disguised as friendship. The financial impact of replacing my 3 problem tenants was significant and positive. The new rent rates I established reflected current market conditions rather than the below-market rates I'd been charging when I thought of my tenants as neighbors rather than customers. The elimination of illegal activities and unauthorized modifications reduced my insurance costs and liability exposure. Most importantly, the higher quality tenants I attracted were less likely to create expensive problems that would require legal intervention or property damage repairs. But the personal satisfaction went beyond financial considerations. For 3 years, I'd been allowing myself to be taken advantage of because I'd wanted to be seen as helpful and accommodating. I'd absorbed costs and inconveniences because I'd thought that generosity would be appreciated and reciprocated. I'd enabled exploitation because I'd been afraid that setting boundaries would be seen as selfish or unreasonable. The experience had taught me that kindness without boundaries isn't actually kindness. It's enabling behavior that allows people to avoid the natural consequences of their choices. My former tenants hadn't learned anything about respect or reciprocity from my accommodating behavior. They'd simply learned that I was someone they could exploit without consequences, and they'd continued escalating their demands until I was forced to implement dramatic corrections. Real kindness sometimes requires allowing people to experience the results of their own decisions, even when those results are uncomfortable or expensive. My former neighbors needed to learn that taking advantage of others eventually leads to losing access to those relationships and the benefits they provide. They needed to understand that exploitation disguised as friendship eventually gets recognized for what it really is, and responded to accordingly. The lesson I learned was equally important. Being generous and accommodating doesn't automatically earn appreciation or respect from the people who benefit from your choices. Some people will interpret kindness as weakness and accommodation as invitation to escalate their demands. Setting clear boundaries and enforcing appropriate consequences isn't mean or selfish. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships and protecting yourself from people who would take advantage of your better nature. 6 months after the evictions, I received an unexpected letter from Brittany, postmarked from a city 3 states away. She'd apparently found new housing and was attempting to rebuild her social media career in a different market. But she wanted to acknowledge what had happened between us and offer what appeared to be a genuine apology for her behavior. The letter was thoughtful and detailed, acknowledging specific ways she'd taken advantage of my generosity and expressing genuine remorse for treating me like a service rather than a person. She explained that losing her apartment and having to move had forced her to confront some difficult truths about her behavior and priorities, and that she was working with a therapist to understand why she'd been so comfortable exploiting people who tried to help her. Most importantly, she acknowledged that the financial reimbursement she'd provided was inadequate compensation for 3 years of taking my time, energy, and consideration for granted. She couldn't repay the personal costs of her exploitation, but she wanted me to know that she understood the real damage she'd caused and was committed to making better choices in her future relationships. I appreciated the letter and the evidence of genuine self-reflection it represented, but I also recognized that it had probably been motivated as much by consequences as by conscience. Brittany had learned important lessons, but she'd learned them through experiencing results rather than through developing empathy or consideration on her own. That was probably the most important lesson for me as well. People don't usually change their behavior because you explain why it's hurtful or inappropriate. They change when continuing that behavior creates consequences they can't avoid or absorb. My former neighbors had needed to lose their comfortable housing situation before they could understand why their treatment of me had been problematic. Sometimes being truly helpful means allowing people to experience the natural results of their choices, even when those results are difficult. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling behavior that prevents people from learning important lessons about respect, reciprocity, and personal responsibility. My building was now full of tenants who understood these concepts naturally, and my life was much more peaceful as a result. I still helped my neighbors when appropriate, but I did so within clear boundaries that protected my time, energy, and resources, while ensuring that assistance remained voluntary rather than expected. The woman they'd treated like their unpaid delivery service had delivered them the most important lesson of all. Respect isn't optional, boundaries matter, and people who exploit others eventually lose access to the relationships and benefits they've been taking for granted. Some lessons are worth the price of an eviction notice to learn properly. The real transformation began 3 months after the last of my exploitative tenants had vacated their apartments. I was standing in what had once been Jake's cryptocurrency mining operation, now completely renovated and gleaming with fresh paint and new hardwood floors, when I realized how much my own life had changed since I'd stopped allowing people to take advantage of my generous nature. The apartment was beautiful in its simplicity, clean lines, abundant natural light, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that comes from spaces where people respect boundaries and treat each other with genuine consideration. The electrical system had been completely rewired to safe specifications, the walls had been repaired from heat damage caused by Jake's illegal equipment, and the entire unit had been transformed from a fire hazard into a welcoming home for someone who would actually appreciate living there. My new tenant was Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric surgeon at the Children's Hospital who worked long shifts and valued the quiet, professional atmosphere I'd cultivated in the building. She'd viewed the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon between surgeries, asked thoughtful questions about building policies and neighborhood amenities, and submitted a complete application with references, employment verification, and first month's rent within 24 hours. During our brief interview, she'd mentioned that she often worked late and sometimes had medical colleagues over for dinner, then asked whether there were any building policies she should be aware of regarding noise levels or guest parking. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, but it revealed everything I needed to know about her character and approach to community living. She was considerate, responsible, and understood that rental agreements created mutual obligations between tenants and landlords. Most remarkably, she'd never once asked whether I might be available to help with errands, food deliveries, or any other personal services. She treated me like a professional property owner rather than a potential resource for her convenience, and she seemed genuinely surprised when I mentioned that some previous tenants had struggled to understand appropriate boundaries in landlord-tenant relationships. The transformation wasn't limited to individual apartments. The entire building had developed a different energy once I'd removed the residents, who'd been creating tension through their entitled behavior and exploitation of others. Conversations in the hallway were friendly but respectful. People held doors for each other, kept common areas clean, and addressed building issues through appropriate channels rather than trying to manipulate personal relationships to get special treatment. The new tenant in Brittany's former apartment was Marcus Webb, a freelance graphic designer who worked with nonprofit organizations and small businesses. He was quiet, professional, and had specifically chosen the apartment because of its excellent natural light for photography work. During our initial conversation, he'd asked detailed questions about building policies regarding home-based businesses, then submitted proper applications for the permits and insurance required to operate a small studio space. Marcus actually reminded me of what I'd thought Brittany was when she first moved in, a young professional trying to build a creative career while maintaining appropriate boundaries and meeting his obligations. But unlike Brittany, Marcus had never asked for special favors or tried to use personal charm to avoid following building rules. He paid his rent promptly, kept his apartment immaculate, and contributed positively to the building's community atmosphere without expecting anything in return except the quiet enjoyment of his living space. The penthouse apartment had been rented to Elena Vasquez, a partner at a downtown law firm who appreciated the building's location and professional management. She paid a premium rent that reflected current market rates, never complained about building policies, and actually complimented me on maintaining such a well-run property. Her lease application had been thorough and professional, her references had been glowing, and her employment verification had confirmed that she earned more than enough to afford her rent without depending on illegal subletting or other questionable income sources. Elena had hosted several dinner parties since moving in, all of which had been conducted at reasonable volume levels and had ended at appropriate times without disturbing other residents. When she'd needed additional parking for guests, she'd contacted the property management company in advance to arrange temporary permits. When she'd wanted to install a small herb garden on her balcony, she'd submitted proper requests and waited for approval before making any modifications. The contrast with the Kims' behavior was stark and illuminating. Elena treated her tenancy as a business relationship with clear expectations and mutual responsibilities, while David and Melissa had treated their lease as an invitation to exploit every possible advantage while avoiding their obligations whenever possible. Elena's approach created a positive experience for everyone involved, while the Kims' approach had generated constant stress and conflict that had ultimately led to their eviction. But the most significant changes had occurred in my own daily routine and mental state. For the first time in 3 years, I could work from home without interruption, from neighbors demanding food deliveries, special favors, or solutions to problems they should have been handling themselves. My phone stayed quiet during business hours except for legitimate property management issues and investment opportunities. My evenings were peaceful rather than filled with text messages from people who treated me like their personal assistant. The financial impact had been substantial and positive. The increased rent from market-rate leases had improved the building's cash flow significantly. The elimination of tenant-related problems had reduced my property management costs and insurance premiums. Most importantly, the time I'd been spending on unpaid services for exploitative neighbors was now available for activities that actually generated income or personal satisfaction. I'd started taking evening classes in commercial real estate development, expanding my knowledge in areas that would allow me to identify and purchase additional investment properties. The 3 hours per week I'd previously spent driving around town fulfilling food delivery requests was now devoted to learning about zoning regulations, construction financing, and market analysis techniques that would help me build an even more successful property portfolio. I'd also begun volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching basic financial management skills to adults who were working to improve their economic situations. The work was rewarding in ways that my previous neighbor relationships had never been, because it involved helping people who genuinely appreciated assistance and were committed to using it to improve their own circumstances rather than simply consuming it as an entitlement. The volunteer work had introduced me to people who understood the value of help when it was offered, and who contributed their own time and energy to supporting others in similar situations. These were relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocal generosity rather than one-sided exploitation, and they reminded me what healthy community interactions actually looked like. Most importantly, I learned to recognize the warning signs of people who were likely to take advantage of generosity rather than appreciate it. During tenant interviews, I now paid close attention to how potential renters talked about their previous living situations, their relationships with former landlords, and their expectations for building amenities and services. Applicants who mentioned problems with previous landlords without acknowledging their own role in creating those problems were red flags for potential entitlement issues. People who asked detailed questions about what services I provided beyond basic property management were indicating that they might be looking for someone to exploit, rather than a professional rental arrangement. Candidates who seemed more interested in what I could do for them than in what they could contribute to a positive building community were likely to create problems similar to those I'd experienced with my former tenants. The screening process I developed was thorough but fair, designed to identify tenants who would treat their rental agreements as professional relationships rather than opportunities for personal exploitation. I checked references carefully, verified employment and income thoroughly, and conducted interviews that revealed character and judgment as well as financial qualifications. The results had been remarkable. My buildings were now filled with responsible professionals who paid their rent on time, maintained their apartments properly, followed building rules without complaint, and treated their neighbors and landlord with appropriate respect. The properties generated higher income with lower management costs, and the community atmosphere had improved dramatically for everyone involved. But perhaps the most valuable outcome had been the change in my own confidence and boundary-setting abilities. For years, I'd been allowing people to take advantage of me, because I'd confused kindness with accommodation and generosity with self-sacrifice. I'd thought that being helpful meant always saying yes to requests, regardless of the cost to my own time, energy, or resources. The experience with my exploitative tenants had taught me that real kindness sometimes requires saying no to people who are trying to use you. Healthy relationships involve mutual consideration and reciprocal benefit, not one-sided extraction of resources and services. People who genuinely appreciate help will demonstrate that appreciation through respectful behavior and appropriate boundaries, while people who simply want to exploit generosity will escalate their demands until they're forced to stop. I'd learned to distinguish between legitimate requests for assistance and attempts at manipulation designed to establish patterns of exploitation. When new tenants asked for help with building-related issues, I was happy to provide appropriate information and support. But when someone tried to establish expectations for personal services that went beyond normal landlord responsibilities, I now set clear boundaries immediately rather than hoping they would eventually become more considerate on their own. The transformation had affected other areas of my life as well. I'd begun applying the same boundary-setting principles to my personal relationships, business partnerships, and social interactions. I was no longer the person who automatically volunteered to handle tasks that others should have been managing themselves, and I'd stopped accepting invitations to social events where I was expected to provide more than I received in return. The changes had initially been uncomfortable, because saying no to people's requests felt selfish and mean after years of automatically accommodating everyone's needs. But the results had been overwhelmingly positive, creating space in my life for relationships and activities that were genuinely fulfilling, rather than merely obligatory. I developed friendships with other property owners and investors who shared similar professional interests and understood the challenges of managing rental properties. These relationships were based on mutual respect and common ground rather than one-sided service provision, and they provided genuine support and encouragement for my business goals and personal development. I'd also begun dating again, for the first time in several years, having previously been too busy managing other people's demands to invest time in my own romantic life. The men I met through professional networking events and social activities appreciated my independence and success, rather than seeing them as resources to be exploited for their own convenience. One particularly meaningful relationship had developed with Robert Martinez, a commercial contractor who specialized in historic building renovation. We'd met when I was considering a major renovation project for one of my older properties, and our professional relationship had evolved into a personal connection based on shared interests in architecture, urban development, and community building. Robert understood the challenges of running a small business and managing difficult clients, and he appreciated my direct communication style and clear boundary-setting abilities. Unlike my former tenants, he never tried to blur the lines between personal and professional relationships, and he consistently demonstrated respect for my time, energy, and expertise. Our relationship was reciprocal in ways that my previous neighbor interactions had never been. Robert contributed his own knowledge and resources to our shared interests, offered genuine support during challenging business decisions, and treated me as an equal partner rather than a service provider for his convenience. We helped each other without creating expectations or obligations that would damage the foundation of our connection. The contrast with my previous experience was remarkable and educational. Healthy relationships enhanced both people's lives through mutual support and shared interests, while exploitative relationships drained one person's resources to benefit someone who contributed nothing meaningful in return. The difference was obvious once I'd experienced both types of interaction, but it had taken the extreme situation with my tenants to help me recognize the distinction clearly. 6 months after the evictions, I received another letter, this one from Jake's attorney, informing me that his client had been charged with multiple violations related to his illegal electrical modifications and cryptocurrency mining operation. The fire department's investigation had revealed that his equipment setup had violated numerous safety codes, and the city was pursuing criminal charges for endangering other building residents through his unauthorized modifications. The letter requested my cooperation as a witness in the case, and it included documentation showing that Jake's illegal activities had been far more extensive than even I had realized. He'd been stealing electricity from common area circuits, creating fire hazards throughout the building, and generating heat and moisture that had been causing structural damage to neighboring units. The inspector's report estimated that bringing Jake's apartment back to safe, legal conditions had required nearly $15,000 in electrical work, structural repairs, and environmental remediation. If I hadn't discovered his activities and terminated his lease when I did, the damage could have been much more extensive and potentially catastrophic for the entire building and its residents. The revelation put Jake's angry threats and legal challenges into perspective. He'd been genuinely furious about losing his apartment, because his illegal activities had been generating substantial income that he'd been hiding from tax authorities and using to fund his lifestyle. My enforcement of legitimate lease terms had disrupted a criminal enterprise that had been operating in my building without my knowledge or consent. The case also revealed how much my previous accommodating management style had enabled problematic behavior throughout the building. Jake had assumed that I was too passive or uninformed to investigate unusual circumstances in my own properties, and he'd been systematically violating multiple laws while assuming that I would never discover or address his activities. The same pattern had applied to Brittany's illegal commercial photography business and the Kim's unauthorized short-term rental operation. All three households had been violating their lease terms and various regulations because they'd assumed I was either too naive to notice or too accommodating to enforce appropriate consequences. Their assumptions had been based on my previous behavior patterns, which had demonstrated that I was willing to absorb costs and inconveniences to avoid conflict with tenants. They'd interpreted my kindness as weakness and my generosity as evidence that I wouldn't stand up for my own interests when necessary. The criminal charges against Jake sent a clear message to current and potential tenants that I was now taking building management seriously and would pursue all available legal remedies against anyone who violated lease terms or endangered other residents. The message was reinforced by the swift, professional manner in which I'd handled the other evictions, and the high quality of the replacement tenants I'd selected. My reputation in the local real estate community had actually improved as a result of the evictions, because other property owners recognized that I'd addressed serious problems decisively rather than allowing them to escalate into more costly issues. The building's improved management and tenant quality had increased its value and made it more attractive to responsible renters who appreciated well-maintained properties with professional oversight. The experience had also provided valuable lessons that I'd applied to my other properties, implementing stronger screening procedures, clearer lease terms, and more consistent enforcement of building policies. The improvements had reduced tenant turnover, decreased maintenance costs, and increased rental income across my entire portfolio. Most importantly, I'd learned that being a successful property owner required maintaining appropriate professional boundaries rather than trying to be friends with tenants. People who rented from me needed to understand that I was running a business based on mutual obligations and clearly defined expectations, not providing housing as a personal favor that entitled them to additional services or special treatment. The distinction had made property management much more enjoyable and less stressful. My current tenants treated me with professional respect and handled their own personal needs without trying to involve me in tasks that were their responsibility. Building maintenance issues were addressed through proper channels rather than personal requests, and rent payments were made promptly without the kind of drama and manipulation I'd previously experienced. The success had encouraged me to expand my real estate investments, purchasing 2 additional properties over the past year, and applying the boundary setting and tenant screening lessons I'd learned from my difficult experience. The new buildings had been profitable from the beginning because I'd started with clear professional standards, rather than gradually trying to correct problems that had developed over time. The transformation had been personally satisfying in ways that went far beyond financial success. I'd reclaimed my own life from people who had been exploiting my time and energy, and I'd learned to create relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The woman who had once spent her weekends driving around town fulfilling other people's food delivery requests was now investing that time in activities that contributed to her own goals and genuine community connections. The lesson my former tenants had learned was expensive but important. Taking advantage of people eventually leads to losing access to the relationships and benefits you've been exploiting. They'd assumed that my kindness meant I was powerless to defend my own interests, and they'd learned otherwise through consequences that had disrupted their comfortable lifestyles and forced them to confront their own behavior patterns. But the lesson I'd learned was equally valuable. Setting appropriate boundaries and enforcing reasonable consequences isn't selfish or mean. It's necessary for protecting yourself from people who would take advantage of your better nature. Real kindness sometimes requires allowing people to experience the results of their own choices, even when those results are uncomfortable or expensive. The woman they'd treated like their unpaid delivery service had delivered them all an education about respect, reciprocity, and the importance of appreciating people who choose to help you. Some lessons are worth the price of an eviction notice, and some teachers are worth the cost of finding new housing when you failed to treat them appropriately. As I locked up Jake's former apartment after showing it to another potential tenant, a quiet accountant who'd asked thoughtful questions about building policies and seemed genuinely excited about the peaceful professional community I'd created, I reflected on how much had changed since I'd first started saying yes to Brittany's food delivery requests. The building was full of people who understood boundaries and reciprocity. My business was more profitable and less stressful. My personal life was enriched by relationships that enhanced, rather than drained, my energy and resources. And I had learned skills and confidence that would serve me well in all future interactions with people who might try to take advantage of generosity or mistake kindness for weakness. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most difficult experiences, and sometimes the best thing you can do for people who are taking advantage of you is to stop enabling their behavior and let them face the natural consequences of their choices. My former tenants had needed to lose their comfortable housing situation before they could understand why their treatment of others had been problematic, and I had needed to experience their exploitation before I could learn to protect myself appropriately from similar situations in the future. The eviction notices I'd delivered had been more than legal documents. They'd been education about respect, consequences, and the importance of treating people with the consideration they deserve rather than taking advantage of their willingness to help. 2 years had passed since the last eviction notice was served, and I was sitting in my expanded home office, reviewing quarterly reports from my now 12-property portfolio, when an unexpected email arrived that would bring the entire story full circle. The message was from Brittany, but this wasn't another apology or attempt at reconciliation. Instead, it was a business proposal that revealed just how much she'd learned from the consequences of her previous behavior. The email was professionally written and carefully structured, beginning with a brief acknowledgement of our past history before transitioning into a detailed pitch for a social media consulting service specifically designed for small property management companies. Brittany had apparently rebuilt her career around helping landlords and property owners develop online marketing strategies to attract quality tenants and build positive community reputations. Her website, which I explored after reading her initial message, showcased case studies of properties she'd helped transform through strategic social media campaigns, professional photography services, and community engagement initiatives. The before and after testimonials were impressive, and her client portfolio included several property management companies in major metropolitan areas. Most remarkably, her entire business model was built around the concept of authentic relationship building and genuine value creation, rather than exploitation or manipulation. The services she offered were clearly defined, transparently priced, and designed to create long-term partnerships based on mutual benefit, rather than one-sided extraction of resources. The transformation was genuine and thorough. The woman who had once treated me like her personal food delivery service had apparently learned to build a successful business by providing real value to clients who appreciated her expertise. She was no longer looking for people to exploit, but rather seeking opportunities to contribute meaningfully to other people's success. Her proposal for my properties was detailed and reasonable. She would develop professional social media profiles for my buildings, create content showcasing their amenities and community atmosphere, and implement targeted marketing campaigns to attract high-quality tenants. The pricing was competitive, the timeline was realistic, and the expected outcomes were clearly articulated with measurable benchmarks for success. Most importantly, she acknowledged our history directly and honestly, explaining how the consequences of her previous behavior had forced her to confront some difficult truths about her character and priorities. The eviction and social media backlash had been devastating personally and professionally, but they'd also provided the motivation she needed to completely rebuild her approach to business and relationships. I was intrigued enough to schedule a video call to discuss her proposal in detail. The woman who appeared on my screen was recognizably Brittany, but transformed in fundamental ways that went beyond surface-level changes. She was more confident but less entitled, more professional but also more genuine, clearly successful but without the desperate edge that had characterized her previous interactions with me. "Carmen, I want to start by acknowledging how much I learned from the experience of losing my apartment," she said during our conversation, her voice carrying a maturity that hadn't been present during our previous interactions. "At the time, I thought you were being unreasonable and vindictive, but I've since realized that you are actually teaching me lessons I desperately needed to learn about respect, reciprocity, and professional boundaries." The conversation that followed was refreshingly straightforward and businesslike. Brittany presented her services clearly, answered my questions directly, and never once tried to leverage our personal history for special consideration or favorable terms. She was selling her expertise rather than trying to manipulate emotions or exploit perceived obligations. Her portfolio demonstrated genuine skill in areas that could benefit my properties. The social media campaigns she'd developed for other landlords had successfully attracted professional tenants, reduced vacancy periods, and improved overall building reputations in their local markets. The photography and marketing materials she created were sophisticated and appealing without being misleading or manipulative. Most impressively, her client testimonials consistently mentioned her professionalism, reliability, and commitment to delivering exactly what she promised without hidden costs or unexpected demands. The woman who had once treated every favor as an entitlement had apparently learned to provide services that exceeded client expectations while maintaining appropriate boundaries and clear communication. After careful consideration, I decided to hire her for a small pilot project involving marketing materials for 2 of my newer properties. The decision was based entirely on the quality of her proposal and the potential value of her services, not on any desire to provide charity or second chances to someone who had previously taken advantage of me. The results exceeded my expectations in every measurable way. Brittany delivered professional marketing materials on schedule and within budget, implemented effective social media strategies that increased inquiries from qualified tenants, and provided regular reports demonstrating the impact of her work on occupancy rates and tenant quality. More importantly, her conduct throughout the project was exemplary. She communicated clearly about timelines and expectations, provided regular updates on progress and results, and handled all interactions with professional courtesy and appropriate boundaries. She never asked for personal favors, never tried to extend our business relationship into social territory, and never referenced our previous history except to demonstrate how much she'd learned from that experience. The success of the pilot project led to an ongoing consulting relationship that had now continued for over 18 months. Brittany's marketing strategies had helped me maintain full occupancy across my entire portfolio, while attracting tenants whose quality and reliability consistently exceeded my expectations. Her professional development had been remarkable to observe, and her business success appeared to be built on the solid foundation of genuine value creation, rather than exploitation or manipulation. But she wasn't the only former tenant whose story had continued to evolve in unexpected ways. 6 months earlier, I'd received a formal letter from David Kim's new law firm, requesting a reference for his application to join the board of directors for a nonprofit housing advocacy organization. The letter was accompanied by a detailed explanation of the work he'd been doing to reform landlord-tenant relationships and improve housing stability for low-income residents. David had apparently channeled his experience with eviction into advocacy work, focused on preventing housing displacement and improving communication between property owners and tenants. His organization provided mediation services for landlord-tenant disputes, education programs about tenant rights and responsibilities, and support services for families facing housing insecurity. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had once threatened me with legal action for refusing to provide unpaid food delivery services was now working to help other people navigate housing challenges more successfully than he had managed his own situation. His advocacy work appeared to be genuine and well-regarded, with testimonials from clients who had benefited from his mediation services and policy expertise. I provided a balanced reference that acknowledged both his previous lease violations and the personal growth he appeared to have demonstrated through his subsequent community work. I couldn't recommend him based on his behavior as my tenant, but I could recognize that people sometimes learn important lessons from their mistakes and channel that learning into positive contributions to their communities. Jake's trajectory had been quite different, and considerably more complicated. The criminal charges related to his illegal electrical modifications had resulted in substantial fines and a period of court-supervised probation. His cryptocurrency trading had apparently ended in significant financial losses that had forced him to declare bankruptcy and liquidate most of his possessions. But the legal and financial consequences had apparently provided the wake-up call he needed to address underlying issues that had been driving his risky and illegal behavior. He'd entered a treatment program for gambling addiction, recognizing that his cryptocurrency trading had been motivated more by addiction than by legitimate investment strategy. The program had helped him understand the connection between his compulsive risk-taking and his tendency to violate rules and boundaries when he felt entitled to pursue his goals regardless of the impact on others. His illegal electrical modifications hadn't been motivated purely by greed, but also by the same addictive thinking patterns that had driven his financial gambling and his exploitation of my generous nature. I learned about his recovery progress through a letter he sent 18 months after his eviction, explaining how the consequences of his actions had forced him to confront issues he'd been avoiding for years. The letter wasn't requesting anything from me, nor was it trying to justify his previous behavior. Instead, it was simply acknowledging the impact his actions had had on others, and expressing genuine remorse for the risks he'd created for building residents through his illegal activities. Jake had found employment as a customer service representative for a legitimate financial services company, work that utilized his knowledge of markets and trading, without providing opportunities for the kind of risky speculation that had gotten him into trouble. He was living in a small apartment, paying his bills promptly, and participating regularly in support groups for people with gambling addictions. His letter included copies of certificates from various recovery programs and community service organizations, where he'd been volunteering to help other people avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed his life. The transformation appeared to be genuine and comprehensive, though I remained cautious about trusting someone who had demonstrated such poor judgment and boundary violations in the past. The most significant development, however, had been the evolution of my own role in the local real estate community. My success in transforming problem properties into well-managed, profitable buildings had attracted attention from other property owners who were struggling with similar tenant issues and boundary-setting challenges. I'd begun offering consulting services to fellow landlords who needed help implementing stronger screening procedures, clearer lease enforcement policies, and more professional management approaches. The demand for this type of guidance had been substantial, as many property owners had fallen into the same patterns of accommodating problematic behavior that I'd experienced with my former tenants. My consulting practice had grown organically through referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations from clients whose properties had benefited from the boundary setting and professional management strategies I developed through my own difficult experiences. The work was satisfying because it allowed me to help other people avoid the exploitation and manipulation I'd endured, while also contributing to improved housing stability and community relationships throughout the region. The consulting work had also led to speaking opportunities at real estate investment conferences and property management workshops, where I shared insights about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while still providing excellent customer service to tenants. My presentation on the cost of accommodation when kindness becomes exploitation had become particularly popular with audiences who recognized similar patterns in their own tenant relationships. The speaking engagements had expanded my professional network significantly, connecting me with investors, property managers, and housing advocates who shared similar challenges and goals. These relationships had provided opportunities for joint ventures, property acquisitions, and collaborative projects that had accelerated the growth of my real estate portfolio, while also contributing to positive community development initiatives. Most importantly, my experience with exploitative tenants had taught me valuable lessons that extended far beyond property management into all areas of business and personal relationships. I'd learned to recognize the early warning signs of people who were likely to take advantage of generosity, and I'd developed effective strategies for setting boundaries that protected my interests, while still allowing for appropriate kindness and community building. The skills I'd developed had made me a more effective negotiator, a better judge of character, and a more confident decision-maker in all aspects of my professional life. Real estate transactions, business partnerships, and investment decisions all benefited from my improved ability to assess people's motivations and reliability based on their behavior patterns, rather than their stated intentions. My personal relationships had also improved dramatically as a result of applying these same boundary-setting principles to friendships, dating, and social interactions. I was no longer the person who automatically volunteered to handle tasks that others should have been managing themselves, and I'd stopped accepting social invitations where I was expected to provide more value than I received in return. The changes had initially been uncomfortable because saying no to people's requests felt selfish after years of automatic accommodation. But the results had been overwhelmingly positive, creating space in my life for relationships and activities that were genuinely fulfilling rather than merely obligatory. My relationship with Robert Martinez had continued to develop into something meaningful and sustainable, built on mutual respect and reciprocal contribution rather than one-sided service provision. We'd moved in together 6 months earlier, combining our resources and expertise to purchase and renovate a historic building that we were converting into high-end residential units. The project had been challenging and rewarding in ways that reflected the healthy partnership we'd built. Robert contributed his construction expertise and project management skills, while I provided the financial resources and property management knowledge. Both of us worked hard, both of us benefited from the success, and both of us respected the other's contributions, without trying to exploit or manipulate the relationship for personal advantage. Working together had revealed how much I'd learned about recognizing and maintaining healthy boundaries. When disagreements arose about design decisions or budget allocations, we addressed them through direct communication and collaborative problem-solving rather than manipulation or attempts to establish dominance. When one of us needed support or assistance, the other provided it willingly, without creating expectations for ongoing one-sided service. The contrast with my previous experience was remarkable and educational. Healthy partnerships enhanced both people's lives through mutual support and shared goals, while exploitative relationships drained one person's resources to benefit someone who contributed nothing meaningful in return. The difference was obvious once I'd experienced both types of interaction, but it had taken the extreme situation with my tenants to help me understand the distinction clearly. The renovation project had been profitable beyond our initial projections, validating both our individual expertise and our collaborative decision-making process. The success had encouraged us to plan additional joint ventures, combining our skills and resources to tackle larger and more complex development projects than either of us could have managed independently. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of our partnership was the way it demonstrated the difference between relationships based on mutual exploitation and those built on genuine reciprocity. Robert never expected me to provide services or resources without appropriate compensation, and I never felt pressured to accommodate his needs at the expense of my own interests. We helped each other because we chose to, not because either of us had been manipulated into patterns of one-sided accommodation. The lesson had applications throughout my life, from business partnerships to friendships to family relationships. People who genuinely appreciated help demonstrated that appreciation through respectful behavior and appropriate boundaries, while people who simply wanted to exploit generosity escalated their demands until they were forced to stop by external consequences. Real kindness involved helping people in ways that contributed to their long-term success and independence, rather than enabling dependency or entitlement. Healthy relationships required mutual consideration and reciprocal benefit, not one-sided accommodation designed to avoid conflict or maintain artificial harmony. As I reviewed the quarterly reports for my expanded property portfolio, I reflected on how much had changed since that first innocent request for food delivery from Brittany 3 years earlier. The woman who had once spent her weekends driving around town fulfilling other people's demands was now running a successful consulting business, managing a diverse real estate portfolio, and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and genuine reciprocity. My buildings were full of responsible tenants who treated their rental agreements as professional relationships rather than opportunities for personal exploitation. My business partnerships were built on clear expectations and mutual benefit, rather than one-sided accommodation. My personal life was enriched by relationships that enhanced rather than drained my energy and resources. The transformation had required learning some difficult lessons about boundaries, consequences, and the difference between kindness and enabling behavior. But the results had been worth every uncomfortable conversation, every enforced boundary, and every decision to prioritize my own interests over other people's comfort. My former tenants had learned expensive lessons about taking advantage of people they didn't understand, but I'd learned equally valuable lessons about protecting myself from exploitation, while still maintaining the capacity for genuine generosity and community building. Both sets of lessons had been necessary for creating the healthier, more sustainable relationships that now characterized my personal and professional life. The eviction notices I'd served had been more than legal documents. They'd been the beginning of a transformation that had affected every aspect of my life. Sometimes the most important changes begin with the decision to stop accepting unacceptable behavior, even when making that decision requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable consequences. The woman my former tenants had treated like their unpaid delivery service had delivered them all an education about respect, reciprocity, and the importance of appreciating people who choose to help you. But more importantly, she delivered herself from patterns of accommodation and enabling that had been preventing her from building the successful, fulfilling life she deserved. As I closed my laptop and prepared dinner for Robert and myself in our beautifully renovated kitchen, I smiled at the memory of Brittany's latest social media post, a professional photograph of one of my buildings, with a caption about the importance of authentic relationship building in property management. The woman who had once exploited my generosity was now helping me market my properties to attract quality tenants who understood appropriate boundaries and reciprocal relationships. Sometimes the best revenge is watching people learn to become the kind of individuals they should have been all along. And sometimes the best reward for setting appropriate boundaries is discovering what your life can become when it's no longer being consumed by other people's entitled demands and exploitative behavior. The next time someone asks me for a favor, I'll be happy to help if the request is reasonable, the relationship is reciprocal, and the person treats me with appropriate respect and consideration. But I'll never again allow anyone to treat me like their personal service provider, while contributing nothing meaningful to the relationship in return. That's a lesson worth every eviction notice I had to serve, every difficult conversation I had to navigate, and every boundary I had to enforce to protect my own interests and dignity. The woman they'd called their reliable neighbor had delivered them their most important education about consequences, respect, and the real cost of taking advantage of people who are kind enough to help when asked appropriately. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.